So I think the skill set for every leader has changed over the last few years, obviously, due to the pandemic. I think for supply chain and procurement leaders, it's been really just one crisis after another, starting with Brexit, then COVID, shipping crises, ships being in the wrong place, containers not available, not being able to get product through. Now we've got a huge commodity price inflation. We've got the impact on energy prices from the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. So really, it's just been one thing after another. So from a skill set perspective, huge amount of resilience required, agility, being able to react and respond quickly, staying calm under pressure, and really being able to lead global teams remotely. So I think those are behavioural changes rather than the technical skill set. Behavioural changes that have impacted all leaders. I think what's interesting in terms of what we're facing at the moment is many leaders today have never really lived through such an inflationary cycle that we're seeing and we're going to be seeing for the foreseeable future. So from a technical perspective, that is something that supply chain procurement leaders have to get their heads around quite quickly, being able to engage with their board. The relationship between procurement and the CFO has just become increasingly close. When I speak to the CPOs in my world, quite frequently they've just come from a meeting with their CFO, or they're just going to a meeting with their CFO, or they were just briefing the board on the raw material input costs that are going to be going through the roof, the energy prices to manufacture. So there's definitely some new capabilities that people have got to understand and develop quite quickly, because they weren't in senior leadership roles the last time we saw inflation like we're seeing today. And then I think that ability to just engage with their board, to be credible, to be resilient, to be able to see the impact on the impact of the business, not kind of just in a procurement silo, but actually having a complete enterprise-wide view and be able to communicate and articulate the options that are going to be available, forecasting as best people can with so much volatility, and communicating early with their senior leadership. So that ability to take the enterprise-wide view and be confident and competent in those board level discussions. I think there's two challenges that supply chain procurement leaders have. One is the kind of the immediate short term in the eye of the storm that we've been in for the last few years now, but so dealing with inflation, dealing with commodity shortages. It's very much about creating the right relationships with the supply base, the supply chain, to make sure that if there are shortages and you're going on allocation, you've got the right relationships in place, that you're still going to be able to get product through to your own company and not be at the bottom of the list when it comes to the suppliers deciding who they're going to work with. So those short-term challenges are just about keeping the supply chain running so that you can still make your product. And obviously, as we've said, communicate in terms of the inflationary pressures to the board so that the organisation can forecast. So there's the short-term issues, but the longer-term issues, are around de-risking the supply chain, which for some that will mean deglobalisation, but for others it's not possible to suddenly create a manufacturing capability closer to home when we don't have manufacturing capabilities closer to home, because for the last 20 or 30 years we bought product from China, for example. So it's strategically thinking what are the supply chain maps going to look like into the future, and where can you redraw them, and should you, and at what cost, and how long is it going to take, versus where you can't redraw them because there isn't the capacity or the capability elsewhere in the world. Or in certain industries, you can't just switch supplier. The regulation, like pharma, for example, is just too lengthy, too costly to certainly overnight introduce secondary and third sources of supply. So it's really about understanding the risks in the supply chain, de-risk where you can in terms of moving and creating new sources of supply, but where you can't, a really, really, really strong risk management strategy. Great data and visibility of what is happening in your supply chain so that you've got early warnings, you're managing the risk. And then also, obviously, at the door of again, all senior leaders, but quite significantly the door of supply chain and procurement leaders is the ESG agenda and scope 3, which is everything that sits outside of your organisation, which for many sits in their supply chain. And that's just another layer of responsibility and regulations going to force organisations, to really understand and take action in their supply chains. So the in-tray is huge. There's the short-term crisis management stuff, and then there's the medium to long-term redrawing, redesigning of the global map, both with a supply chain resilience perspective, but also an ESG agenda as well. So in supply chain and procurement, it varies based on industry. The requirements of a supply chain are very different in, FMCG to automotive, pharmaceutical to financial services. So I don't think there's one answer to what does the future look like. And I think if many of us had a crystal ball, we'd quite appreciate that right now. But I think what it looks like is continued shocks to the system, and therefore supply chain procurement leaders need to expect that, be prepared for that. We don't know what those shocks might be, but I think there's going to be continued disruption. So leaders are going to be required to build resilience into their supply chains, whatever the shock may be. And clearly, you can't plan for everything. But I think if the supply chains are more resilient in the first place, then you'll cope better with shock. But I think for the next 2 to 3 years, the commodity variability and volatility pricing, inflation, these are not going to go away overnight. So the next 2 or 3 years, it still, I think, very much is about risk management, mitigating that risk, mitigating and offsetting inflation as much as possible, at the same time as really understanding where the weak links in your supply chain are from a kind of a risk perspective, from a single source perspective, and de-risk as much as possible.